The UN has classified COVID as not just a health crisis, but a human, economic, and social crisis. We spend most of our time talking about the health aspects, and many governments' crisis committees are composed of epidemiologists and not sociologists or economists. But we don't spend enough time talking about the human, economic, and social aspects. My talk today will focus precisely on these. The interesting thing about the COVID pandemic is that it did not affect all parts of society equally. Its health consequences disproportionately targeted the elderly and immunocompromised people. Its economic effects disproportionately affected different industries. So some industries and companies had a boom, like companies selling electronics, computer microphones, vitamin supplements, the pharmaceutical industry, while other industries, like the hospitality industry, service, performing arts, the tourism sector, were almost completely shut down. And most importantly, its social effects disproportionately affected poor and otherwise disadvantaged people. People without access to support services and financial safety nets. The focus of today's presentation is on the social aspects of the crisis. What are the main effects on our social relationships, both individually and as collectivities? Let me begin by starting with a topic that I actually won't be spending a lot of time talking about, the health effects of the crisis. This is something I'm not an expert in, but any conversation about the epidemic has to include health issues first. These do not include just the effects that have arisen directly as a consequence of COVID, but also effects that have arisen indirectly. Long-lasting mental health issues, depression, suicide, illicit drug use, alcoholism, increases in mortality up to a third associated with social isolation. Mental health effects of disasters have been historically shown to impact more people and last much longer than the actual health effects of the epidemic. This is what we call the tail of mental health issues that persists long after the health epidemic itself is over. Then there are all of the undiagnosed health problems, lack of routine exams, lack of preventative medicine, such as pre-screening for cancer, for which we already have known effects. These are all effects that are not related directly to COVID, but are indirect, and they deserve a front seat in our discussion about the responses to the crisis. Now let me move to the focus of the presentation today, which is the social relationships. Here, the main point that I want to drive home is the uneven effect the epidemic has had on different sectors of the population and the worsening of socioeconomic disparities. To drive this point home, I'll talk about two main things that are actually in my area of expertise: education of young people and social and ethnic relations. Okay, let's compare two scenarios. First, we have a picture of a happy family in the kitchen. This may be a scenario that many people in my own circle, in my privileged circle, are familiar with. When the epidemic hit last year, despite anxiety and insecurity, my secure job and our secure jobs moved online. Our employer provided the extra screen, the extra microphone, the headphones we needed to work remotely. Maybe we adopted or bought a dog. Maybe we even moved into a vacation home in the mountains. We delved into home projects with a family. We cherished this long-lost opportunity for quality time, learning how to bake bread, playing board games, growing a garden, maybe learning to play a new instrument. The second scenario doesn't really need a name. These are families who already live in overcrowded spaces, who don't have quiet spaces to work or study. These are people who don't have space to simply exist in privacy. They might not have a stable internet connection, they might share one computer for all family members, and they might also be exposed to a series of other conditions like stress and anxiety over lost jobs, money, or basic survival. They might also include aggressive or violent family members or sick family members that need to be taken care of full time. So while I've painted a picture of two extremes, the response to the crisis has assumed this situation. Our responses have imagined this kind of family. And I hate to admit this, but in schools, in the university setting where I teach, but also, especially in primary schools, we have consistently assumed a situation much closer to this picture. The UN predicts that 192 of the world's governments and 87% of the world's students, which is 1.6 billion people, across the globe are affected by school closures. So what is the effect of assuming the first versus the second scenario? The effect of not assuming this scenario was that we did not try harder to keep elementary schools open. We didn't think more carefully about disabled and disadvantaged children and their caregivers. In poor countries, the situation has especially affected the education of girls, where the closing of schools could end their school careers altogether. In the US, for example, one of the first noticed outcomes of the pandemic last March was that many kids relied on the school's lunch as their only hot meal of the day. Access to safe, private spaces to study, access to the computers and the internet, access to parents who are capable and willing to help, and living in a healthy psychological environment, all of these have been assumptions of this first scenario. But even if we focus on a developed economy like Slovenia, many students actually face these kinds of issues. University students might not have the resources we assume they do. They might have a bad internet connection. They might not have a place that's quite quiet, safe, or private. And I'm ashamed to say that some of the policies that we implemented during the pandemic, like requiring students to have cameras on during lecture, or requiring students to have both a phone and the computer online on Zoom during exams, have been highly disadvantaging for some students. At every step, the assumptions we have been making have been regarding some imagined average student. But in reality, this is our imagined student, a privileged one. Overall, the main effect, and let me be clear, I'm not talking about the effect of the epidemic itself, but of how we handled the situation in schools, has led to the deepening of inequality. Parents who are better educated or have more disposable time could help their kids in school. And ultimately, these kids, even with a year of remote education, will be quite okay in the long run. In fact, kids who were in healthy homes perhaps even benefited from having a year at home with their parents, and their pets certainly did. Well, on the other hand, kids and students in already vulnerable situations are now even worse off. The effects of not going to school for a year and a half has detrimental effects for the long term. And here, we're not talking just about missed education opportunities. We're actually talking about the delayed socialization of young children, the absence of peer education for teenagers, and even for university students, a lack of interaction and meeting new people, which is what students take away much more from college than they do the actual content they are taught. This is related to the second issue that I would like to spend the rest of the time talking about, which is how we actually relate to other people. So psychologists have spent time studying the effect of loneliness extensively, showing its relationship to cognitive decline, physical health, and emotional well-being. But these effects, the effects of loneliness, are not just psychological, they're also profoundly social. So even before the epidemic, sociologists have spent a lot of time researching how our social networks, so people that we're surrounded with, connect every aspect of our lives. Sociologists have shown that one of the main effects of the epidemic has been a decrease in so-called weak ties. This means the disappearance of all ties, apart from the strong ones, the ones that we are immediately connected to. Temporary ties have also disappeared. So this is people with whom we have small talk. Maybe you chat with a barista, making your coffee in the morning. You have a brief conversation with a building receptionist when you arrive to work, or a chit-chat with a waiter in a restaurant. But it also includes a drastic reduction in weak ties with people outside of your immediate social circle with whom you'd usually be in touch with. For the most part, we have maintained our strong social ties, our immediate families, and our best friends, right? Either in person or virtually. But the broader networks of groups, the people that we might see maybe once every few weeks, people who are our friends but are not in our immediate circle, those ties have completely disappeared. And we know from before that weak ties are actually essential. They're essential for getting new information, for finding a job. And sociologists have actually also found that these little chit-chats and these random encounters are really important for productivity in work and for creativity in particular. It turns out that it's precisely these random ties we have with a wide network of people, these encounters and conversations that affect our lives more than we thought. So while organizational scholars have been trying to figure out how to make up for this spontaneous chit-chat in the virtual world, sociologists have been looking at the effect of these kinds of ties and social relationships. In particular, a shrunken social network also means a decrease in the amount of information you are exposed to. It decreases the kinds of ideas you hear. At the same time, we're spending increasing amounts of time on social media. A new book by my friend Chris Bale called Breaking the Social Media Prism has shown that social media amplifies this effect. It functions like a prism that distorts our identities, empowers status-seeking extremists, and make people who have moderate opinions seem to disappear. This creates so-called echo chambers, an amplification of the same ideas from the same people, and an illusion that these ideas are actually widely accepted. Related research is now being done on the spread of conspiracy theories which thrive in these conditions. Social media make it easy to find people who think the same way you do, while the internet and fake news allow you to find confirmation for whatever it is you're looking for. In our academic circle, it's easy to make fun of people who get stuck in this, but the issue is serious. Prolonged isolation, a shrunken social circle, and extensive time alone on the internet have proven to be a lethal combination. There are people everywhere who are anxious, alone, perhaps they feel unfairness or they feel like they're oppressed by the government lockdown measures. And interestingly, while we're online and in touch with more people via social media than ever, it seems like the very nature of these digital networks actually functions differently than the in-person networks. And related to this change in social interactions, we have also witnessed a polarization of society, where the epidemic has been fueling political divisions. Existing divisions now have an extra layer: how our friends feel about mask wearing and how they feel about vaccines. This is not surprising. We know that when people feel threatened, they tend to look for sources of threat, and they find that threat in outgroups. And let me just remind you that our governments across the world have not contributed anything to this. So feelings of being under threat are widespread. This was already noticeable at the beginning of the epidemic when Trump kept calling the virus the Chinese virus. Although shifting blame and pointing fingers at the perceived culprits has happened everywhere. Across the globe, we have seen a resurgence of populism and support for anti-immigrant conservative policies. None of this is new. Economic insecurity is directly linked with propensity to support populist parties. This is, of course, used by politicians. And indeed, epidemics are a gift for authoritarians who now have a platform to act in the name of the people to protect the nation, and at the same time are allowed, because of the crisis, to reach deeper into the civil liberties of the peoples they govern. The long-lasting effects of these breaches into democracy have yet to be documented. Now, let's continue on to the good news. So the first good news I will share relates to the first point I talked about, access and inequality. The good news here is that we have learned that a lot of work actually can be done via distance. We know that an entire range of services can be done digitally. For instance, if we think about the Upravna Nota in Slovenia, the municipality office in charge of IDs, driving licenses, registrations, and so on, the source of many people's nightmares, well, during the crisis, it digitized its services, providing the tools to do everything online. In others, similar patterns occurred. Things that prior to the epidemic supposedly had to be done in person now magically could be done online. This, along with moving many conferences, lectures, meetings, and work online, has greatly helped make things more accessible and could, long-term, help those who are disadvantaged. It could help those who aren't able to walk to the Upravna Nota, people who need to occasionally stay home and work remotely, and they can maybe more effectively balance their family and career, or maybe in our academic circle, people who aren't privileged enough to be able to travel for conferences. The crisis has made us realize that many of these things can be done digitally and is providing more incentives to make services more accessible. The other piece of good news in terms of our social relationships is that the pandemic can help us move from an individualist to a collective mindset. Epidemics function in ways where individual cause-benefit analysis does not work. Right? While young people were not at high risk of mortality as the elderly, almost everyone you know has somebody in their family who is older, who is at risk because of some other condition, who might be a cancer patient. Vaccines work the same way. They're not a calculation of individual cost versus gain, but of collective cost versus gain. There's no clearer picture than during an epidemic to realize how much our individual well-being, our health, and our happiness depends on the collective. And where nationalism is concerned, which is my primary area of research, I have found that people's sense of belonging has also shifted and in some cases become more inclusive as a result of the epidemic. As the response to COVID was led by nation states and not the wider international community, people have begun realizing that their fate is actually connected to that of their co-nationals, resulting in a shift from ethnic to civic views of citizenship. The results of this research give me hope that despite the polarization I talked about earlier, all other mechanisms will change feelings of belonging and social relations in more inclusive ways. And let me end here with a thought that I usually start off with in one of the courses I teach called The Sociology of Social Change. As sociologists, we spend a lot of time thinking about how does social change happen and how we can bring about social change. And one of the main things that students learn in this class is that it's precisely during times of crises when status quo can be thrown into question. The Black Death in Europe in the 14th century contributed to a series of peasant revolts that eventually ended the feudal system. And the influenza pandemic of 1918 contributed to increasing support for social security. Let's make the COVID epidemic go into the books as another pandemic that changed the status quo into question by taking better into account the social and the economic and not just the health implications of the epidemic.